Hi, I'm Cailey, librarian at Mentor Public Library.
And I'm Meg, also a librarian here at Mentor Public Library, and welcome to this week's edition of All Booked Up with Cailey and Meg, where each week we give you different book recommendations related to a specific topic. So this week's theme is old Hollywood. So all those old black and white movies, any of those old Hollywood figures and stars that you love, you're going to hear about them all today.
Yes, and I love that it turned into old Hollywood because we wound up picking books that all had to deal with old Hollywood.
I know.
And all of the books that we're going to talk about today are available here in our library physically, as well as online via Hoopla or Libby by Overdrive, completely free with your library card.
Absolutely. What's your first book, Cailey?
So my first book is called The Girls in the Picture by Melanie Benjamin. I actually read this one with one of my book clubs, I think last year, and my other book club will be reading it in November this year. And so this is a historical fiction book that takes us like way, way back before the talkies. And before even the silent films were really big, because this book is about Mary Pickford and Frances Marion. And I'm sure that you've heard of Mary Pickford, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But
I've never seen anything.
Yeah, generally she's kind of overshadowed in the silent films.
Yeah.
When you say silent films, like everyone thinks of Charlie Chaplin, who, by the way, close friend of Mary Pickford. But Mary Pickford was the original America's sweetheart. Mm-hmm. And fun fact, she's actually Canadian.
Nice.
But Mary Pickford was like the first celebrity. She was recognized everywhere. And before people even knew her name, she was the girl with the curls. And everyone loved her. And she basically was there at the founding of Hollywood and has hundreds of films to her name, literally hundreds. And even less well known than her today is Frances Marion, who was a trailblazing screenwriter, producer, and director in a time where women were mostly on screen and often uncredited. And both of these ladies were really like there at the beginning in Hollywood, and they were best friends. And so this book is fiction, but it relies a lot on interviews and notes and journals and all of that from back then. And it takes us through these two women who both started out in very uncertain circumstances and at times quite scandalous. They both had divorces. But it takes them through the highs and lows of their lives, their careers, their friendship, and kind of like defining Hollywood. And Mary Pickford was famous for these movies where she played a child, and how that struggle in her real life to be like a real adult. And the book was just fascinating to me in general because the characters were very believable, very riveting in that. And all of the different things going on in this time, it starts off in, I think, the 1910s, goes all the way into the 60s, and just the way that Hollywood completely went from this nothing town. Movies went from being these like 4-minute things all the way to what we know today in the course of these women's lives and careers. And after reading this, of course, I had to look up films with Mary Pickford and Frances Marion, and I'm happy to say that some of them are available on Canopy through the library.
That sounds awesome. I'm going to have to check those out because, like you said, I'm much more familiar with like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. So this seems extremely interesting to learn about like one of the most popular figures from that time. Mary Pickford is also mentioned in my next book, which is called Letters from Hollywood, Inside the Private World of Classic American Movie Making. And this is edited by Rocky Lang and Barbara Hall. Now, this is a really, it's more of a coffee table book, but it's the kind that once you pick it up, I don't think you're going to want to put it down until you finish it. It's that interesting. It's a collection of real, in full color photographs and letters shared between all sorts of figures from the movie making business, spanning all the way from silent era all the way to like the early 1970s. So whether
I love that stuff.
it's yeah, amazing. It's Audrey Hepburn, letters from Audrey Hepburn, Ingrid Bergman, Cary Grant, movie makers behind the scenes, so big directors, screenwriters, studio heads, just any sort of aspect of the movie making business is detailed in here. And really it shows a portrait of, like you mentioned, like how different and how much Hollywood changed in that span of time. So one of the big examples is there's quite a few letters written to Joseph Breen, who was the head of the Production Code Administration, as you know. So, the things that you could put in movies, there were a lot stricter limits than there are today. So some of the things, like, you may know a few, but like some of the things include, if a bad guy does something, he can't get away with it. So there has to be justice. I know, tell me about, you were telling me about one earlier that I found really interesting.
One of my favorite ones is the fact that any on-screen kisses had to have 3 feet on the ground, which is how the whole sort of like leg lift in the lady during the kiss started. And I just find that so fascinating.
It is. It's really fascinating. And these letters are interesting because it'll be like the directors and screenwriters like writing to the production code saying, we're going to fix this, but do you understand that we're not really trying to promote the bad thing, we're just trying to show it? So it's like they're kind of like going along with it, but also you can tell like their real feelings behind their words as well. So it's very interesting to read those. And then there's more lighthearted ones. There's letters between, like I said, Mary Pickford writing to Gloria Swanson from a train, just a little chatty letter, so it's really cute. There's a really funny letter between Ingrid Bergman to Cary Grant, where Ingrid's writing from her bathtub, thanking Cary Grant for accepting the Oscar on her behalf. So just little funny, slices of life that you would see. And then ones that I think maybe have had an impact on today, like there's one from Betty Davis to Jack Warner, the head of Warner Brothers Studios, fiercely advocating for her contract negotiations, like saying that actors should have more say in the roles they do. They shouldn't have to be stuck with one studio. And those are things that I think had a big impact on, what actually happened, because she was so successful that she had that leveraging power. So seeing how that worked behind the scenes is fascinating. And like I said, you don't have to read it through, you can just pick up and read it. But I think once you get your hands on it, you're gonna wanna just stay in it for a long time, so.
Yes, I'm definitely going to have to check that one out.
Yes.
And my next book is actually a nonfiction as well. And it's called We'll Always Have Casablanca by Noah William Isenberg. And mostly I picked this because I love Humphrey Bogart.
Yes.
And Casablanca is one of my favorite films. And this book really takes you behind the scenes to tell you about a lot of things that, the layperson doesn't always think about when it comes to movies, especially like setting and casting and lighting and music and all of these little puzzle pieces that have to work so well for a movie like Casablanca to be listed as like the second best movie of all time. It totally is. Citizen Kane's number one. But there's a lot of interesting stories in this book that the author has compiled from interviews, from letters, from all sorts of records that were left behind, including stories about the different actors, their lives before being in this movie, their lives after, and interesting facts about them, like some of the actors who participated in this film were actually refugees at the time themselves, including Peter Lorre, who had a big role in this film and went on to be quite successful. And there were other actors who were featured in this film after escaping their hometowns in Eastern Europe that had been overtaken by the Nazis during this time. So there's a lot of interesting tales in here. And the author does a really good job of like diving deep and connecting all of these to show how, while all of this happens behind the scenes, nobody still knew that this wartime romance movie was going to take off the way it did. And part of that was that a lot of people had heard of Casablanca because it was a well-known spot for refugees. And just 2 weeks before the film was released, Casablanca had actually been like liberated by the Americans. So it was just great timing. Some of the other stuff that's discussed in here are the censorship rules that they had to abide by. If you have seen Casablanca, you know that there is a sort of affair that takes place, and all of that had to be done so carefully in order to pass the censor board. And it even discusses, there's a fun chapter that talks about Casablanca's place in pop culture and how it's been featured and parodied and used all over the place. And if you're just a film buff, or if you love Casablanca or Humphrey Bogart, or just like learning about old Hollywood and how it all worked, including like the studio stuff, this book is just an awesome one to dive into.
Yeah, and that would be very interesting because that's just such, like you said, such an iconic film. Yeah, really one of the best films ever for sure. My next one is also on another, I would say, pretty iconic film, just a few years before Casablanca. It's called Finding Dorothy by Elizabeth Letts. And what do you think that? Yeah, so it's, you know, based on the world of Wizard of Oz, but the protagonist in this work is Maud Gage Baum is her full name, and she is the wife of Frank L. Baum, who wrote the book that The Wizard of Oz is based off on, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So it's from her perspective in 1938 when they are just starting production for The Wizard of Oz, and Maud is around 77 years old. Frank has been dead for about 20 years, so she feels very protective of this book and of the story and how it's going to be portrayed in the film. So she's kind of, you know, skeptical, a little, like she's trying to worm her way onto the set. You know, they don't really want her on there too much, but she's like, I have to be and oversee this because it's very important to me, and, you know, to my husband's legacy. So when she gets on set, you know, she's in this certain mood, but then she hears Judy Garland practicing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and her heart just melts. And it takes her to another place and reminds her of when she first met Frank, and, you know, the writing process of when he was writing all these books and their romance. So it goes back and forth between around the 1880s and then the present day, which is 1938, where she forms this friendship with Judy Garland. So in the 80s, she has this really interesting like upbringing. Her mom was actually a suffragette, and she was, you know, one of the few women who was able to go to college. And Maud actually quits college to marry Frank, and her mom is actually disapproves of that. So kind of, you know, you wouldn't think that like that kind of like your mom would disapprove back then when it was so hard to get into college. So it's an interesting take, and their romance is very sweet. And then going into the present day in the 30s, her relationship with Dorothy is so sweet because she becomes protective. Because if you've seen the recent Judy biopic, you know, Judy at this time had a pretty rough life. They were forcing her to take diet pills and like eat almost nothing, the studio heads, and she was having this rough time. So those struggles are kind of portrayed in the book as well. So the conversations, you know, it's a little left to the imagination and it's a little fiction, but I think the way she portrays it is very nice. And I just, like you said, behind the scenes, look at the movie, but also their friendship, between Judy and this woman. So I like this. And I also like it because, you know, as librarians, we're always concerned with like, how's the book going to be portrayed into the movie? So it kind of gives a look into that whole mindset, you know.
That's true. And I think that is such an iconic film too. You know, everyone has seen Wizard of Oz. So it's one of those ones where it's an easy touch point for Hollywood. Yeah. And it was still so early in Hollywood as well that it became what it was. So yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, well, those are all of our books for this week about old Hollywood. Hopefully you enjoy them and jump back into the past with us a little bit.
Yeah, this is one of our favorites, right? I love this subject.
Yes,
we could talk for hours.
So next week, our topic is going to be our favorite books we've read this summer.
Yeah, so this is going to be any and all genres, fiction, nonfiction, just the ones that really were our standouts for the summer that we haven't mentioned yet in any movie, in any of our previous videos. So keep an eye out for that one. It's kind of maybe like our award show for the summer in a way.
Now I feel a little bit stressed about my picks.
I know, we're going to have to dress like, because there's not going to be any award show this year, so we'll have to be fancy. But yeah.
Anywho, so all of the books we mentioned today are available through the library and online, so hopefully you'll get a chance to check them out. And we'll see you next week, and happy reading.
Bye.